Okay, during the break, Kelly looked up the word cladistics, so we'll know what Colin Peterson was commenting on when he said no one has ever produced a species by mechanisms of natural selection. No one has ever gotten near it. Cladistics, according to the dictionary, is having to do with or based on the branching out of ancestral lines of descent in the process of evolution. So basically it's this whole idea of descendancy from one species to another, like men evolving from apes, etc., in the evolutionary tree is what that has to do with. And he is an evolutionist, so it's an interesting comment by him. Next is a quote from Niles Eldridge in an article called An Extravagance of Species in Natural History magazine, in which he said this: but natural selection per se does not work to create new species. Pierre-Paul Gross, in a book called Evolution of Living Organisms, said, he is also an evolutionist, said the role assigned in natural selection in establishing adaptation, while spaciously probable, is based on not one single sure datum, which means they haven't got any actual data, not even a single datum, which indicates the fact of it. It's still all in their imagination. Michael Pittman from Cambridge University, in the book Adam and Evolution, said natural selection can only reduce rather than increase genetic variability. It is indeed a force counteracting the tendency for mutation to cause a degeneration in the quality of living organisms, but it cannot be creative. Now, let's take just a moment, look again at natural selection. The idea is simply that if there is one organism that is more likely to survive than another, then probably it will naturally survive better than the other. Now, if that sounds redundant, that's just simply because that's what it is. It's just the observation that the more fit tend to survive either exclusively or better than those that are less fit. Okay, therefore, when there's mutations, which the vast majority are bad, what will natural selection do? It'll weed them out. It'll weed out the changes, get rid of the changes, and it'll tend to maintain the quality of the living organisms that are already in pretty good shape to start with, or in fact perfectly designed. But it does not, natural selection doesn't create anything. It simply gets rid of those degenerative changes. Now, their logic is the good changes will be left to be passed along. But what in reality happens is the natural creature in its nice, good state is what's left. And even if there is a good change in a single organism, the question still comes, is it passed along to another organism and accumulated together with other changes which bring about any actual long-term change in anything? The statistical probability of that is slightly low. Okay, all right, where am I going here? I got quotes all over the place. I got to keep track of them here and get them in the right order. Okay, another comment now on natural selection concerning Charles Darwin. I just learned this. I didn't realize this. Here's a thing about Charles Darwin. Charles Darwin later became uncertain about natural selection as a cause of evolution, eventually bowing to the weight of scientific evidence and abandoning it in the 6th edition of his book, The Origin of Species. I didn't know that he gave it up in the later editions of the book. In the latter part of his life, right. Now, that doesn't mean he'd become a creationist. It just means that he recognized that his concept of natural selection, even though it might even be observable, as we just described, doesn't result in evolution. Okay, here's some other quotes now. I made copies so I could read them of a bunch of quotes, and then I decided after the fact what order I wanted them in, so that's why I'm trying to track these things down here. Here's a quote now from Randall Hedke. I think I quoted from him before, but here's another quote from him. The divine essence in evolutionary theorizing in the Creation Research Society Quarterly, said this about Darwin. Darwin finally did deal honestly and objectively with the data. He abandoned evolutionary natural selection. Then, in order to avoid conceding to special creation, okay, see, when he abandoned natural selection, he didn't concede to special creation, but in order to avoid conceding to special creation and to continue to meet the scientific requirement for postulating an ongoing mechanism, he switched to Jean Lamarck's theory of acquired characters, which never had credibility. So he switched to something else that didn't work either. Also, here's a quote from Norman Macbeth, we quoted earlier, but another thing called The Third Position in the Textbook Controversy, published in the American Biology Teacher magazine. He said this, let me tell you who he is. He's a retired attorney and an evolutionism researcher who authored a book called Darwin Retried. Has a law degree from Doctor of Jurisprudence from Harvard Law School and a Bachelor of Arts from Stanford University. He said, Darwinism has failed in practice. The whole aim and purpose of Darwinism is to show how modern forms descended from ancient forms. That is, to construct reliable phylogenies, that is, genealogies or family trees. In this, it has utterly failed. That's what Macbeth said about...
What was Lamarck's theory on gene what?
Okay, where was that quote?
The last one.
Jean Lamarck's theory of acquired characters, which never had credibility. I don't even remember. I remember studying Lamarck when I studied genetics, but I also vaguely remember that it was just a historical sequence that was discounted. So whatever that was, I don't even remember now what it was. It's been over 30 years since I studied that in school. And obviously they set it aside anyway, so I don't remember what the details are of that.
Who was the author of Darwin Retried?
Darwin Retried was written by this guy named Norman Macbeth.
And Philip Johnston wrote Darwin on Trial.
Darwin on Trial, yeah. Darwin on Trial was written later than this one, so they're not related books. Okay? All right. I got some more quotes now that are kind of combination quotes on mutations and natural selection together. An evolutionist by the name of S. Lovetrup, he must be English, in a book called Darwinism, The Refutation of a Myth, said this: Micro-mutations do occur, but the theory that these alone can account for evolutionary change is either falsified or else it is an unfalsifiable, hence metaphysical theory. Now what he's saying is the idea of mutations bringing about evolutionary change has either been falsified by the actual observations, or you have to argue that you can't falsify it, and it's a matter of metaphysical theory. Metaphysical is a term for philosophical, and it often applies to religious concepts. Okay, so then it's a matter of faith. Okay, so he's saying it's either been discounted by the facts, or if you say no, you can't scientifically disprove it, then it's something that can't be disproven, then it's metaphysical and it's non-scientific. Yeah.
Is it just me with the deja vu here, or have you spoke about this exact thing before?
Tonight?
What you just said. You mentioned metaphysics last week.
Well, metaphysics occasionally has been mentioned, yeah, in other quotes, but not this quote.
Oh, that quote.
I have not read this quote before. In fact, this is the first time I've ever read it when I taught on this subject.
Okay.
And even in other times, this is an addition I'm adding here when I teach on this. So I don't know. It must be deja vu. You know how that happens. Okay, anyway, he goes on to say, I suppose that nobody will deny that it is a great misfortune of an entire branch of science, if an entire branch of science becomes addicted to a false theory. I'd say that would be a great misfortune, wouldn't you? But this is what has happened in biology. I believe that one day the Darwinian myth will be ranked the greatest deceit in the history of science. When this happens, many people will pose the question, how did this ever happen? Jeffrey Wicken, in an article called The Generation of Complexity and Evolution in the Journal of Theoretical Biology, said this: a generative principle providing the raw material for natural selection. Excuse me, I left a word out. As a generative principle, providing the raw material for natural selection, random mutation is inadequate, both in scope and theoretical grounding. Evolutionist Dr. Pierre Paul Gross, I quoted from him before, but this is a different quote now. Former president of the French Academy of Sciences and the scientist who held the chair of evolution at the Sorbonne in Paris for 20 years, said this, quote, this is in a book called Evolution in Living Organisms. No matter how numerous they may be, mutations do not produce any kind of evolution. This is an evolutionist. Then he went on to say, the opportune appearance of mutations permitting animals and plants to meet their needs seems hard to believe. Yet the Darwinian theory is even more demanding. A single plant, a single animal would require thousands and thousands of lucky, appropriate events. Thus, miracles would become the rule. Events with an infinitesimal probability could not fail to occur. There is no law against daydreaming, but science must not indulge in it. Okay?
If he's an evolutionist, what does he believe in?
Well, I've noticed over the years that a lot of evolutionists have just come out and said, hey, our theory stinks, it doesn't work. But then they proceed to go on to other notions and theories with the same ultimate end, some evolutionary idea, but they make some kind of a change in their position to try to come up with a way to really explain it.
So he's saying that cellular mutation doesn't work as a theory?
He's saying that, number one, mutations do not produce any kind of evolution in general. Okay? But if there is change, it would have to be many changes in a single individual to result in the alleged evolutionary changes.
Many lucky ones.
Many lucky ones to boot. Okay? And so the whole theory of just accumulating a little change here and a little change there doesn't work either.
I remember now what Lamarck's theory was of
Okay.
characteristics.
All right.
Massive mutation at once.
Ah.
It was like dinosaurs giving birth to birds.
You sure?
Yeah.
Wasn't it? I thought it was massive.
Okay.
The hopeful monster. I think Lamarck is that, let's say that something, he stretched his neck during his lifetime.
Ah, okay. I remember now. That's right. I remember that. I remember
his
that.
offspring would not have a longer neck, but that's the Lamarckian theory.
The theory was that if he did that, then somebody'd pass it along, but clearly the geneticists recognized that it wasn't being passed along if there was such a change. To change the outward appearance of a creature in its lifetime does not change the offspring. But he was theorizing that it did. Is that the idea?
The acquired characteristic theory is complete.
Yeah.
The giraffe reached for the fruit high up in the tree.
Right, because the other fruit was already been eaten, see. So the guy with the longest neck survived and passed along long necks. By the way, on that point, what's required for a giraffe to function and survive isn't just simply a long neck. It's a whole battery of systems that have to work in conjunction with one another to make a long neck work and to get blood all the way up to that pea brain up there. And for a creature to suddenly have a long neck, he'd have to evolve all the things that make it work together at one time, or to get it gradually over a long period of time would require him evolving all of those different mechanisms at one time for that to all work together. And that multiplies the possibilities mathematically and statistically so many more. It's inconceivable. I mean, the whole thing is laughable. Okay, now I want to at this point read this quote from Julian Huxley on the evolution of the horse. I think this would be an appropriate time to do it. Julian Huxley, who is now in a position to know better about all this, given that he died 15 or so or more years ago, I've lost track of time on when he died, but it's sometimes early 70s or later that he died. In a book called Evolution in Action, commenting on the evolution of the horse, said the following. Listen carefully and be persuaded if you can. The proportion of favorable mutations of 1 in 1,000 doesn't sound like much, but it is probably generous since so many mutations are lethal, preventing the organism from living at all, and the great majority of the rest throwing the machinery slightly out of gear. Now, before we go on, understand exactly what he's saying. He's going to take 1 out of 1,000 mutations as being good. But he admits that actually it's generous on his side to say that. Okay? So he's admitting that it's probably worse than 1 out of 1,000. It might be 1 out of 2, 1 out of 5, 1 out of 10,000, if that even. But he's going to pick 1 out of 1,000 as being good. And the rest are killing everybody off and at least making him dysfunctional. He goes on to say, in other words, mutations are pretty rare, and a good mutation is very rare. No more than 1 out of 1,000 at the most is a good mutation. Then he says, a total of 1 million mutational steps sounds like a great deal, but it's probably an understatement. It takes 1 million mutational steps to evolve a horse. Now, I'd like to know where he gets that figure. How did he decide it takes 1 million mutational steps to evolve a horse? Did you know that there's millions of parts in the nucleus of a single cell of our bodies?
1 million parts is in the
I just last night watched a video of a scientist commenting on the intricacies of the nucleus of a cell, and that there's millions of parts which they've discovered through electron microscopes they didn't used to think were there. They didn't know about, but there's millions of parts in there. But he's saying it takes 1 million mutational steps to evolve a horse. And he admits that though it sounds like a lot, it's probably an understatement. Okay, but we'll allow him his figures. We'll allow him 1 out of 1 million, 1 out of 1,000 good mutations, and we'll allow him 1 million mutational steps. He says it takes 1 million mutational steps to evolve a horse. After all, that means only 1 step every 2,000 years during biological time as a whole. Now, they say that life has been evolving for 2 billion years. The 4.5 billion year age of the Earth, the first 2.5 billion years, the Earth was cooling down from a hot ball, you see. And then when it got to an adequate temperature, and then these chemicals that somehow got there, we don't know how any of this stuff got there in the first place, but somehow then life began to evolve 2 billion years ago. So he says 2 billion years of evolutionary biological time through an evolutionary process means that there's 1 million mutational steps it takes to evolve a horse. That's only 1 every 2,000 years. Sounds like not very much, right? Every 2,000 years coming up with 1 good mutation. However, let's take these figures as being reasonable. Notice that? However, let's take them as being reasonable. They're unreasonable figures on his side of the coin. They're beneficial to him, unreasonably beneficial to him. But he's saying let's take them as being reasonable with this proportion, and with that is 1 out of 1,000 good ones, and 1 million mutational steps. And let's, he says, without any natural selection. Let's just try to get 1 million good mutations in a single organism. Or for that matter, 1 million good mutations in a row, I guess is what he'd be going for. He says, we should clearly have to breed 1 million strains, which is 1,000 squared, to get 1 organism containing 2 favorable mutations. And so on up to 1,000 to the millionth power to get 1 containing 1 million. Now he's looking for the odds against this, okay? Now let me simplify it for you. If you have the odds of 1 good mutation out of every 2 mutations, then what are the odds? The odds against it are 2 to 1, or 1 out of 2. Now to get 2 good ones together, you'd have 1 out of 2 times 1 out of 2, which would be 1 out of 4 chances of getting two good ones in the same organism at one time. And it squares on the way up. Okay? And so to get 3 would be 1 out of 2 times 1 out of 2 times 1 out of 2, which would be 1 out of 8. Well, he's doing it with 1 out of 1,000, not 1 out of 2. So it's 1 out of 1,000 times 1 out of 1,000 to get 2 good ones. That's 1 out of 1,000,000. And to get another good one together with that would be 1 out of 1,000 times that, which would be 1 out of 1,000,000,000. You understand how it goes? And you have to raise 1,000 to the millionth power to get the chance of having a horse evolve on those terms be 1 out of 1,000 to the millionth power. Okay? He says, now listen to this, of course this couldn't really happen. Now he admits it couldn't really happen. But, listen now, he says, but it is a useful way of visualizing the fantastic odds against getting a number of favorable mutations in one strain through chance alone. Now, according to them, what have they got besides chance? Yeah, but that's still chance, isn't it? Okay. Yeah, but it's still working with chance, isn't it? See? It's chance. And he's saying those are the fantastic odds against getting it through chance alone. 1,000 to the millionth power, he says. He's just kind of in awe at his own number. He says, I mean, he wrote that. 1,000 to the millionth power. When written out, this number becomes the figure 1 with 3 million zeros after it, and this would take 3 large volumes of about 500 pages each just to print. And your chances of getting it are 1 out of that number. 1 out of 1,500 pages of zeros with a 1 in front of it. He says this is a meaninglessly large figure. Now, do you know why he says it's meaninglessly large? Because we can't even begin to grasp how large that figure is. It doesn't even communicate to us how utterly impossible that is. And then he says, but it does show what a degree of improbability natural selection has to surmount. You get what he just did there? He said this, of course, is impossible. But now he says this shows what a high degree of improbability natural selection has to surmount. And it can circumvent it. With 1 with 3 million zeros after it is the measure of the unlikeliness of a horse. We've gone from impossible to improbable to unlikely. The odds are against it ever happening at all. Well, thank you, Julian. No one would ever bet on anything so improbable happening. And yet, it has happened.
Oh, amazing.
Thanks to the working of natural selection and the properties of living substance. Where'd they get the properties of living substance? Thanks to the working of natural selection and the properties of living substance, which make natural selection inevitable.
His faith is as big as that number.
Because he goes from something that he admits is completely impossible to improbable to unlikely to inevitable.
But it's not really faith, though. I mean, it's blind.
Well, faith can be blind faith. The point is, he believes it. Whether it's true or not, he believes it. So it's faith. In this case, it's empty faith. It's worse than blind faith, because a person could have blind faith in something that's real and turn out to be right. Yeah, there are no words to describe this. There are no words for how much faith this man has demonstrated. If he had only turned that faith toward God, imagine what a great believer he would have made. With that kind of faith, that ability to believe.
Childlike. Evolutionary folly.
Yes, it is. Okay, now, this brings me to some other quotes now. Here's another quote from I.L. Cohen. We quoted earlier from the book Darwin Was Wrong, A Study in Probabilities. He said this: to propose and argue that mutations, even in tandem with natural selection, are the root causes for 6 million viable, enormously complex species is to mock logic, deny the weight of evidence, and reject the fundamentals of mathematical probability, which we've just demonstrated in the quote from Julian Huxley. And that's with one single organism with all the numbers leaning to his advantage. Okay? Here's another quote from a paleontologist and evolutionist, Stephen Jay Gould, who said, this is in an article, in a lecture rather, he gave called, Is a New and General Theory of Evolution Emerging? See, they finally recognize the shortcomings. And then they say, whoa, we got to come up with something else. And instead of turning to creation and to God, they turn to another bit of folly to the same end, to an evolutionary end. He said a mutation doesn't produce major new raw material. You don't make a new species by mutating the species. Okay? Here's a quote from Roger Lewin, Lewin, from Science Magazine in an article called Evolutionary Theory Under Fire. He said the central question of the Chicago Conference, apparently the evolutionists had a conference in Chicago, was whether the mechanisms of microevolution, that is, mutations and natural selection, could be extrapolated to explain the phenomenon of macroevolution. Now, macroevolution is the major big changes that they claim have occurred. Okay? Now, there's a thing called microevolution. Some people will use the term to describe the variations and the apparent adaptations of various creatures, like where a particular bird will have some difference from another bird of the similar species, same species or a very closely related species, and it'll have some differences that will make it survive better in a particular environment, and the one will disappear and the other one will survive. Okay? And that would be viewed by some as microevolution. Now, I don't think it's any form of evolution, but if you use that term to describe the variations and changes and differences in creatures within their species, then for sake of discussion, let's grant microevolution just for the terminology. And this guy, who is an evolutionist, is admitting that, with those things, it still doesn't add up to macroevolution, these major changes from one species to another. He says, at the risk of doing violence to the positions of some people at the meeting, the answer can be given as a clear no to the question of whether mechanisms of microevolution, mutations, and natural selection could be extrapolated to explain the phenomenon of macroevolution. He says the answer can be given as a clear no. Here's a quote from Arthur Kestler in a book called Janus, A Summing Up. I don't even know what that title means. Anyway, he says this: in the meantime, the educated public continues to believe that Darwin has provided all the relevant answers by the magic formula of random mutations plus natural selection, quite unaware of the fact that random mutations turned out to be irrelevant and natural selection turned out to be tautology. Tautology is a fancy word. I looked up in the dictionary because I didn't know what it meant either. It means redundance or useless repetition. Okay? So that's what he thought of natural selection. Okay. So he says random mutations turned out to be irrelevant, and so also did natural selection. All right. Evolutionist Richard Schmidt, PhD and a whole bunch of other titles, an outstanding geneticist and professor of zoology at the University of California, frequently pointed out that no one has ever succeeded in producing even one new species by the accumulation of micromutations. He said this in The Material Basis of Evolution, quote, the facts of microevolution do not suffice for an understanding of macroevolution. And then I mispronounced Herbert Nilsson's name earlier, the Swedish guy. It's Heribert, Heribert. Nilsson, Nilsson. Those Swedes often have too many letters. Swedish evolutionists said this: if one allows the unquestionably largest experimenter to speak, namely nature, one gets a clear and incontrovertible answer to the question about the significance of mutations for the formation of species and evolution. They disappear under the competitive conditions of natural selection as soap bubbles burst in a breeze. Okay? Then Richard Lewontin, professor of zoology at the University of Chicago and co-editor of the American Naturalist, the University of Chicago and the American Naturalist being purely evolutionary institutions and publication, said this in the Scientific American magazine in an article called Adaptation. Quote, natural selection over the long run does not seem to improve a species' chance of survival, but simply enables it to track, to keep up with the constantly changing environment. Okay? So he's saying at best, all it does is it results in certain of the critters surviving better in the new environment. Natural selection just means the ones that aren't as fit don't survive. And so it just keeps them on track. It doesn't change them. It doesn't make them into new creatures.
Actually, doesn't it? It removes variety, doesn't it?
Ultimately, it removes variety, if you will. Yeah. It gets rid of the change.
It gets rid of all the other raw material.
Right. The bad stuff.
Well, it's not
Or the changed stuff.
And it's not even necessarily changed. It could just be a variety that doesn't exist well
Right.
in a cold climate.
Right.
When
Right.
It would exist good and warm.
Right. So it is a reduction of probabilities. Here's a quote from A.E. Wilder Smith, excuse me. He's a creationist, and he made a film called The Origin of the Species, and he also wrote a book called The Natural Sciences Know Nothing of Evolution. He said the whole theory is dependent upon the idea that you won't get by chance a complete new organ produced at once, but you will get small changes. But those small changes up to something better will be a disadvantage to the species until they are complete. Think about that. And as they never are complete, natural selection prevents the drift upward just as effectively as it prevents the drift downwards. That being the case, we cannot account for the fact that basic kinds of animals have remained constant through all these years by this feedback mechanism. So he's making a point now, an excellent point, that if you just for a moment theorize about all these little micro changes that all add up ultimately into major changes, such as in some organ or some specialization of the creature, which when you add all those up into a bunch of those, pretty soon it becomes an altogether different creature. He's simply saying that in the process of achieving this new wonderful special ability, special organ or special feature of this creature, it isn't a benefit to them until they get the complete thing. In fact, it can be harmful.
The in-between critters aren't able to survive.
Right. Right, exactly.
I remember that.
Which, what?
Dr. Stuart Crane talks about this bat ratology,
Bat ratology.
a rat that forms into a bat, that the half-formed bat can't fly and it can't move around on its legs very well because it's got half wings.
Mm-hmm. Right. That's a good way of describing exactly the problem there with what Wilder is bringing up. Okay, I'm looking for a critical, important quote, a couple of quotes here that temporarily seem to be missing in action. What did I do with it? I tucked it away somewhere. Aha, there it is. Okay. On this point now, I'm going to quote from some evolutionists. Dr. Colin Peterson from the British Museum of Natural History, in a book called Evolution, said this: the main reason for inventing these macro mutations is that there are some features of plants and animals which can hardly be imagined as arising by gradual steps. Now, before I go on, he's saying we've had to invent macromutations. We're not talking about per se macroevolution now, where you have one species emerging out of another. He's saying instead of having little teeny micro changes by mutation, we're going to have major changes in parts of the organism so that they're complete by one fast, big mutation. And he's giving the reason why. He says, the main reason for inventing these macromutations is that there are some features of plants and animals which can hardly be imagined as arising by gradual steps. The adaptive value of the perfected structure is easily seen. In other words, this structure which they assume to have developed somehow provides an adaptive benefit to the environment for this creature. Well, look, this creature survives better in this environment because it has this thing. So he says the adaptive value of the perfected structure is easily seen, but the intermediate steps seem to be useless or even harmful. For example, what use is a lens in the eye unless it works? A distorting lens might be worse than no lens at all. How can the segments of an animal like the earthworm or centipede arise bit by bit? An animal is either segmented or it is not. That guy sounds like a creationist. He says the usual answer to such questions is they are due only to the failure of the imagination. He's saying most evolutionists say, well, your problem is you just can't imagine how this could happen. And so you've had to come up with macroevolution, or macro mutation. But indeed, they are trying in their own feeble way to come up with the solution to the very problem that Smith raised. They're being halfway honest. They're saying, hey, micromutation doesn't hack it. It doesn't do it. It's silly. It doesn't work. So instead, they come up with something even sillier. A macromutation.
What would that be?
Boom! Here's a mutation that resulted in this whole new function of the creature that it didn't have before. It didn't have an eye. Bang! It's got an eye through a mutation. A fully functional working eye through a single mutation. Big mutation. Now, that could include a mutation of a whole batch of genetic data at one time. So it might be a bunch of little ones all interconnected and coordinated into one major change at one time. I don't know quite how they would... The chances of that are zero. Anyway, here's another quote from Stephen Jay Gould, evolutionary paleontologist, in an article in Natural History magazine called Not Necessarily a Wing. He says, but how do you get from nothing to such an elaborate something? If evolution must proceed through a long sequence of intermediate stages, each favored by natural... let me rephrase that. I just realized I made two sentences out of one sentence. Let me read it again. But how do you get from nothing to such an elaborate something if evolution must proceed through a long sequence of intermediate stages, each favored by natural selection? You can't fly with 2% of a wing, or gain much protection from an iota's similarity with a potentially concealing piece of vegetation. He's talking about critters that God has designed to blend into their natural habitat and to be camouflaged. He's saying, where's the benefit and protection from a little bit of similarity with your environment? How, in other words, can natural selection explain these incipient stages of structures that can only be used, as we now observe them, in much more elaborate forms? One point stands high above the rest. The dilemma of incipient changes... one point stands high above the rest, the dilemma of incipient changes, these little tiny changes along the way. He says, Mivart, some other evolutionists, identified this problem as primary, and it remains today. Now, the solution of Patterson and Gould and some of these other guys, what is it? Macromutation. Sudden appearance of change of an entire functional part of the creature. Perhaps the sudden appearance of the eye. The sudden appearance of a hand that can grab. Now, there's, again, major problems with all of that. And we're out of time here. We've only got a couple of minutes left. I can't do justice to anything at this point with the time that we have left. So we're going to have to finish this next week. But
Are there critters with just one eye?
I don't know. Anybody know any critters with one eye? Maybe there are. But they're not in the process of evolving another eye. If they have one eye, they have the ability to function with one eye, and they're not evolving another one. But here's a fundamental problem. We do see micro mutations. Okay?
Yeah.
Now, they might be artificially applied, as some of these quotes have indicated, in the laboratory, brought about. We don't really see them being brought about carried on from generation to generation by natural selection in the environment, out in real life in nature. But we do see them happening in the laboratory, and we might even see them passed along into a degenerated, deformed fruit fly in the laboratory. So we at least see that much. Now, of course, we don't see fruit flies turning into mosquitoes or house flies or dragonflies or birds. So we don't see evolution happening as a result of micromutation, but at least you see micromutation. But I'll ask you this. Does anybody know of anybody who's ever seen, even the most ardent evolutionist, who's seen any macromutation that's resulted in a complete organ or a complete benefit to an organism with a completely functional part? That's just instantaneously through macro mutation taking place? Nobody has ever seen that at all. Any form of that. So they've just gone from something that's unreasonable to something that's actually even more unreasonable. Because they're saying, hey, micro evolution does not result in macroevolution, and it can't happen, and it doesn't work. And they're right about that, but then they go to something even more absurd to try to conclude how it happened, because what is their premise? Their premise that it has happened. Therefore, since it doesn't happen by design, then it must have been through some unseen, unobserved macro mutation somewhere in the past that nobody ever recorded, but it's obvious that it happened because, look, it's there. So it's an even greater level of faith. And who are we to, how can we prove that it didn't happen? See, it becomes now, again, philosophical, metaphysical. It becomes religious. It becomes something that we can't test it, and we can't disprove it because nobody was there to say, no, it didn't happen that way.
Well, and of course, since we don't have a PhD, we can't quite argue against such fine...
Right. You have to have a PhD to be able to even try to reason against these birds, because without a PhD, who are you to talk? No. Anyway. That was facetious on my part. We're out of time. Next week we'll begin with an illustration before we press on further into this, and I'll have a few more quotes in summarizing this whole thing of mutation and natural selection. But I want to take a mathematical illustration, the simplest thing. I'm going to start with a one-part organism that might be a one-cell organism, and it's going to stay one cell, but it's just going to mutate into 200 parts within the cell. Like I said, there's 1 million parts or more in the nucleus of a human cell. We'll just go from a 1-part cell to a 200-part cell, and we're going to mutate it and let it happen by chance. And we're not going to give such benefit of the doubt as Julian Huxley gave himself 1 out of 1,000. We're going to give 1 out of 2 good mutations, and we're going to give it all kinds of opportunities that are most unreasonable against our view, and we're going to see how utterly ridiculous and impossible statistically something as simple as that is, to say that it evolved through mutation and changes. When we're done looking at that illustration, you will see in something you can grasp how utterly mathematically impossible and statistically impossible it is for evolution to happen in any form by these things. We're out of time. Let's close in a word of prayer. We'll look at more of it next week. Father, we do thank and praise you again for what you've been showing us. We thank you for showing us the folly of the world and how your truth stands out against the ridiculous reasonings of men. We thank you that you have created us as you have, perfectly designed, and even held together by the power of your spoken word.